My name is John Pape. I'm the interim chair of the Education Department, and it's my distinct honor and privilege to introduce Professor Andrea Flores to talk about her terrific new book, which I hope you will all buy afterwards, The Succeeders, How Immigrant Youth Are Transforming What It Means to Belong in America. Before we start, I want to say a huge thank you to David and Mahazan for organizing this and for inviting me to come and introduce Andrea, and to Leah, Caitlin, and Mary Ellen for helping to coordinate the whole event. Andrea's book is a real masterpiece. If you haven't read it yet, I highly recommend it. It traces her years of detailed fieldwork with a local educational nonprofit in Nashville, Tennessee, called the Succeeders Program. Andrea uses the program and the experiences of the students and family in it, and the students and faculty in it, to explore the experience of Latino immigrants in South Nashville and to problematize conceptions of success for immigrant origin youth. These students strive for the so-called American dream, largely embodied by and instantiated in educational progress, to feel a sense of belonging in a country that made them question this at every turn. Andrea argues convincingly that this striving was not only transformative for them personally, but also reproductive of social inequalities widely seen in schools. The striving was both exclusionary and inclusionary. Andrea's thesis is in and of itself transformative and will push forward our understanding of both the role of schools and education more broadly, and the ways that immigrant youth navigate the key institutions and responsibilities in their lives: schooling, family, and peers. There is so much here for others to explore and to build on, and I expect this book to be an important part of the canon on the experiences of immigrant students, the role of educational institutions, and educational striving and national belonging, how students progress through the K-12 school system and through college, and how the lived experiences of students in schools and the relationships they have with adults in the building influence their lives. So I think the book is clearly a scholarly success. But to me, the book resonated for several more specific reasons. First, Andrea's thick descriptions and well-crafted prose took me back to the high school students I used to teach. When she described the special relationship between Jim and Edwin, I saw the faces of Brian and Roberto sitting in the hallway. There was so much here that resonated with me about the students that I taught. These students that she describes were clearly individuals from a time and place far from where I taught, but their experiences were broader and more universal, and Andrea's descriptions made them real. Second, as a member of this broad and multidisciplinary department, the education department here at Brown, the book served again as a clear reminder of the value that different disciplines, different approaches, different modes of inquiry can bring to a shared problem or question. I study educational policy largely through the lens of economics, and have recently been exploring inequality in students' progress to and through the K-16 educational system in Massachusetts. We sit in a society today where the promise of the American dream, social mobility through education, is increasingly less common, where education has become even more reproductive of existing structural inequalities. Andrea's work highlighted the complicated notions of success for students, success in striving, in belonging, and in kinship that I will take back to my work. The book was also a clear reminder of why the work that we all do here really matters. Angel's story, highlighting the importance of institutional inclusion and the role that Mrs. McCann's high expectations and care played in his success, put in stark relief the critical role that educators and educational systems can play, the opportunity for authentic and caring relationships to be truly transformative for students. And finally, as I read, I was moved. I was at times depressed and angry and uplifted. I thought that Andrea's analysis of caring was really inspirational. As she writes, belonging is an always unfinished process we all take part in that is enacted through small daily acts of inclusion and exclusion. Chief among these acts is caring. While she notes that caring is on short supply at times at the national level, it is in the interpersonal connections, the one-on-one interactions, where caring can really live and thrive. As Andrea notes, policy is one way politics are done, but it is not the only way. All of our actions are critical in creating the world we want to see. With this in mind, I really hope you all take the time to read and to buy the book. It's a terrific contribution to the field and speaks so well, I think, to the current national moment. We all have a lot to learn from it. So, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Andrea Flores.
All right, we can all go home because John did a great job. Thank you for that incredibly kind and generous introduction. John, thank you so much. Thank you to David, Mahasan, and Caitlin for organizing this event. And I'd also like to say thank you to all of you who came out, and thank you to the education department, both students, faculty, and students, faculty, and staff, because it's been my home here as a scholar, and it's been a real privilege to be part of it, and it's been a wonderful, welcoming place where I have felt a sense of belonging. So, as an anthropologist, I have to start with a story. And this is actually how the book starts. So during the talk, I'll probably do some reading and some extemporaneous speaking. Miss Millerton's classroom stank. It was the usual mix: Axe body spray, fresh Doritos, caustic hand sanitizer, and vanilla-scented perfume. 5 college admissions officers and a handful of Latino college students stood at the head of the classroom, zigzagged in front of a graying whiteboard. They had come to talk about their universities to a packed house of Latino high school students. The high schoolers were part of Succeeders, the nonprofit college access program for Latino youth in Nashville, Tennessee, where I conducted my work. One by one, the collegians, mostly Succeeders alumni, introduced themselves and described their sometimes circuitous path to college. As the Succeeders and I politely suppressed late afternoon yawns, Mateo began to speak. His forceful words electrified the sleepy room. At college, I learned a lot about myself. They developed me to be a better person. If you have the will, the determination, that fire inside you to be something more, make your parents proud. College is hard, but it's going to make you a better person. He then pointed to the standard issue flag drooping in the public school classroom's corner. You see that flag right there? It stands for freedom. There's no reason you can't be successful here in the greatest country in the world. It's our responsibility as Hispanic Americans. So following Mateo's address, a student who was more of a troublemaker, not the prototypical college-going student named Lalo, was talking to the Succeeders program coordinator, Liz. And to give you a sense of him, one college admissions officer had asked, "What's our mascot?" and giving away like free prizes. And he answered, "Un güero," a blonde or white person, right? And it caused me to laugh inappropriately during this meeting. And it was accurate. As students kind of shuffled out of the classroom, I heard what Lalo now tentatively whispered to Liz. He quietly vowed to graduate, to stop misbehaving, and to make his father proud. In just 5 words that I heard countless times throughout my fieldwork, he expressed the same sentiments and understanding of his education's purpose as Mateo. I want to be somebody. Lalo's terse statement of ambition to be somebody and Mateo's call to success on behalf of kin and country revealed that educational attainment had far deeper meanings for these youth than just getting a diploma. Only through educational success, Lalo believed, could he be somebody, someone worthy of a valuable person who's worthy of the respect of others. Only through educational success could Mateo, quote, fulfill his responsibility as Hispanic American. Only through educational success could they both make their parents proud. And over the course of my fieldwork, I would come to understand that the ultimate stakes of academic achievement for the Succeeders and their families were, as John described, belonging in the United States of America. So in my book and in today's talk, I argue that the Succeeders link higher educational attainment to their claims to national belonging in a period of increasing nativism in the United States. And when I talk about belonging, I mean 2 things, right? The first is, as Nira Yerval-Davis talks about, feeling at home in the nation, feeling an emotional attachment to it and feeling comfortable. The second is this sense of social incorporation as a valued participant, a somebody, in the daily life, cultures, and institutions of the nation, regardless of your citizenship status or your cultural heritage. And so I'm making this argument that institutions matter, and particularly in this case, educational institutions matter, because in our access to that and our participation in kind of the daily rituals and routines, that's where this abstract category of belonging becomes real, becomes something that we live. And so obviously for many of these young people who I'll discuss, about half of whom had undocumented status, and another great percentage of which came from mixed status families, where there were folks in their families who were undocumented, legal citizenship was at the fore of their minds, but every student wanted this sense of feeling institutionally valued and a sense of feeling at home in the nation. And so in the book, I tell kind of two stories about belonging. One that kind of reflects the exclusionary, racialized, and moralized notion of belonging in the United States, that relies on young people kind of taking on these stereotypes about themselves and trying to disprove them to show that you conform to dominant modes of who is valuable. And the second is how young people are transforming the terms of belonging by centering care and connection to others. So as they were striving in school, they kind of became critical of the somebodies they were striving to be, because to become a somebody, there is a no one, a nobody, right? And they see that it is their parents, their friends who are labeled at risk, who are those people. And for their refusal, the succeeders' refusal to leave those people behind, is a counter to kind of the petty inclusion that's being offered by what we see as a hostile nativist state that breaks families through deportation, retracts social welfare from the most vulnerable, and increasingly limits inclusion to the best and brightest. So, with that in mind, I'm going to kind of briefly breeze through methods and context of research, kind of give you a sense of this particular historical moment, but also what Nashville, Tennessee is like. Little theoretical framework, which I'm sure is why you're all here, right? And then a little bit of some more stories, kind of getting to these two stories of belonging, and then some implications for how we might think about how this might inform practice and our notions of what it means to be an American. So, as I mentioned, I'm an anthropologist, and as you see here, I spent a lot of time doing that research. 1 year of extended field work in 2012 to 13, but I've continued to follow up with the young people that I worked with since then, and my central method is participant observation, which is when an anthropologist kind of takes part in the daily rituals and routines of everyday life and records in notes what they see there. And so in the context of my research, that meant going to succeeders' meetings, like I mentioned in that opening vignette. It also meant going on field trips. It meant being with students and their families, going to graduation parties, having dinner, going to the school play. I also conducted interviews with a subset of the young people who represented the kind of broad demographics of the group, but also were active participants. And I'm happy to talk more about my methods in Q&A. But moving on to some kind of I'm going to start my context at the very broad level of kind of policy and kind of popular thinking about belonging, and kind of funnel down to what it's actually like in the Succeeders organization. So backing up to 2001 is when the DREAM Act was first introduced in Congress, which provided a pathway to citizenship for undocumented young people who arrived at a certain age and could prove that they had lived in the United States and had met some other characteristics, one of which was about educational attainment, right? And as John discussed, right, a lot of my book is kind of about this notion of the American dream, and I think it's no surprise, right, that this group of young people are being presented as dreamers, consonant with this notion of the American dream, that these are the kind of hopeful strivers. So it did not pass in 2001. There's still no pathway to citizenship, but this picture in the front of President Obama here is in the Rose Garden the day he announced the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals executive order in June 2012, which is when I started my extended field work. And this was a real moment of, provided deportation relief for young people who had entered the country at a certain age and had continuous residency and met other criteria. It did not provide a pathway to citizenship, but instead a work authorization document and allowed them to access work in the regulated economic sector. And so this seemed like a real moment of relief. But the Obama years are one of a set of contradictions of relief and repression. So here, the same year, record number of deportations under Obama, and I drew my little Microsoft Word arrow here to show that the deportations reached another record in 2013 and only got, in the last year of his presidency, reaching a level not quite at the level of record. So here we see in that contradictory policy environment, we also see a broader moralization of belonging. And I'll point to a speech that Obama made where he talked about families, not felons, right? We also see this logic in dreamers, not dropouts, right? That there was a hierarchy of migrants who are the right kind, the best and the brightest, the good and the great are welcome. And this is also at the same time that there are these broader debates of whether or not family ties or merit, defined narrowly as the chance of economic success, will be the driver of future immigration policy. So we may think about the Obama years kind of more sunnily than the Trump years, but they weren't so great either. So this is a collage I made of Nashville, and when we think about Nashville, we probably think about this, the Grand Ole Opry, country music, if you've had a 21st birthday or a bachelorette party in Nashville, drunkenly going from honky-tonk to honky-tonk. But in some ways, this is kind of a show that Nashville puts on about itself. Its number one industry is healthcare. It's had a big economic boom since the 1990s, some of which is related to tourism. But due to this blooming economy, we've seen the city become increasingly diverse, drawing internal migrants from across the country, but also international migrants from across the global south. And you see here, right, this international market, this taco restaurant and old gas station. And I'd also like to draw attention to these pictures down here. It's also been we have this vision of the South sometimes as a backward place. But Nashville's been the site of a lot of immigrant youth organizing, and in fact, when 10 attorneys general attempted to sue the government over the legality of DACA, there were a series of protests happening in Nashville, and the Attorney General of Tennessee removed the state from the lawsuit. So it's also the site of active immigrant organizing, largely from young people. So this was a map of Nashville that was very popular on Tumblr a few years ago. And we can see here, as John mentioned, South Nashville, this is where I did my research. We see some very poorly spelled Guatemala, which stands out to me because that's where my father is from. But you see here, right, that there's a mix of migrants from across Iraq and Mexico and Guatemala, but also this Southern Pride Nashville fans, NASCAR fans. This area of the city, the South, had been largely a place for working class whites to live. And as you see here, it's bisected from the rest of the city through highways. And so this kind of increasing area of diversity was largely invisible in terms of residential segregation, and also, as some authors have argued, invisible to city government as a result. Before the 1970s, this was kind of the rural outskirts of the city, so more farmland. So since then, the city is increasingly diverse. It is 12% foreign-born, which may not seem like a huge number, but that actually represents the historical highs we saw at the turn of the 20th century, thought of as kind of the big era of international migration. And there's two main streams of it. There's the Latinx population, largely economic migrants coming from Central America and Mexico, and this much smaller refugee population. Remember, we see here Iraq mentioned, and I bring that up because Nashville has the largest Kurdish population in the United States, and in fact, after the fall of the Saddam Hussein regime, It was one of 2 sites in the country where the diaspora could vote in the first free election. The reception of migrants has been mixed overall. In that early period where there was more residential segregation, it was largely kind of ignorance of this population. It kind of builds to a crescendo in the early 2000s, largely when some of those first migrants' children are going to school. And in the 2008-2009, there was a English-only referendum that would make all city services only in English with no translation. So if you're a Kurdish speaker, a pipe bursts on your street, call up the city government, no one's going to translate for you. It didn't pass. It went to a referendum. And people have said since the fall of English only, the city's become more welcoming. And as one student put it to me, it's not Arizona, referring to SB 1070 and the anti-immigrant policies that characterize that state. So when people talk about places like Nashville, this kind of new destination of migration, they often refer to kind of demographic change or policies like I've just done. But schools are an important place to think about how societies come to understand migration and think about belonging. So they've been central, schools have been a central place where foreign-born populations and native-born populations actually have sustained contact with each other. And Jamie Winders, who's a geographer who works in Nashville, states that schools are frequently the institutions through which immigrant students and parents first feel connected to the local community. So as you see here, the schools became increasingly diverse. This is the same number of languages that are spoken in New York City public schools. But this diversity came very quickly and came into the context of a school district that understood diversity in terms of a black-white racial binary and monolingual English speakers. So it was not necessarily prepared to meet the learning needs of this population. To kind of meet those needs, they started bringing in additional community partners to deal with providing professional development for teachers, family outreach, and like the Succeeders program to kind of provide targeted services to students to help with the very disparate graduation rates between new arrivals and locals. So in some ways, Succeeders is kind of the odd man out of education, right? It's the educational success story. We see that the students who are attending Nashville public schools that participated in Succeeders had 100% graduation rate as opposed to the kind of 70% we see in their schools. But as you'll see in the talk, I'm arguing that's not the way we're going to measure success here. The way we're going to talk about it is how young people rethought what that success means to them and what those critiques may mean for all of us. The program started in this period, of kind of very low graduation rates as a sporadic Saturday weekend, once in a while program. By the time I got there, it was bi-weekly in 6 schools. I did research in 4 of them. It was a multi-hour after-school clubs where it focused on college access, college readiness issues, leadership development, and also engaged in local trips to college campuses, work sites, and individual case management of students' college applications. There was a staff of 2 people who did that. And as you see, there were 500 participants who had a point of contact with the organization a year. 150 were very engaged, attending 3 or more events. And as I mentioned, mostly from Mexico and Central America. A majority of the students were undocumented. And again, as I mentioned, there were higher academic outcomes here, but students often underscored that what they valued about Succeeders was feeling a sense of belonging in a place where they could share experiences unique to them in navigating the educational pipeline. So here we are, bearing all this context in mind. What am I kind of getting at when we think about belonging in the American context? So decades of kind of cross-disciplinary research has shown that belonging is not just a simple question of are you a citizen or not, a legal status that confers or denies rights. But belonging, and sometimes even our claims to legal membership, are rooted in how we live and how that is perceived by others. Some scholars have referred to this as the culturalization of citizenship. And Alicia Galvez, who's an anthropologist, states that, quote, attitudes and dispositions are associated with good citizenship, and we judge others' deservingness to membership and belonging through how closely they align with those cultural and moral values. So again, let's go back to that example of the dreamers, and we think about how they are perceived as worthy migrants. They came here through no fault of their own. They speak the language. They know the sports teams. They grew up here and share cultural references. And they're also striving for success, right? Individual achievement over diversity towards the American dream. And so beyond kind of this alignment with national norms, there's kind of one other layer here to the kind of moralization of membership, and that's the racialization that happens at the same time. The idea of the prototypical American is often racialized as white, including by minorities themselves. And as Leo Chavez has argued, the striking numbers about Latinx migration to the United States have been leveraged by anti-immigrant advocates on the local and national level to argue for what he terms a Latino threat narrative, where Latinos represent not only a problematic demographic shift away from whiteness, but a cultural one that stands as a fundamental challenge to this imagined core of white Protestant American cultural, moral, and political values. So this is something that we see continuously through history. The Latino threat is just one iteration of it, and a way that minoritized and migrant populations have often found a way out of that, is through the idea of conforming to this notion of success and the American dream. And as we may know, right, the American dream is this mythological understanding of the United States as a land of opportunity where any self-possessed person can succeed individually due to their own merits. And I'm arguing that this is not just the ability to succeed economically or in a given meritocracy, but that matters. It's what the success represents that matters. Embedded in that belief of kind of a scrappy individual's ability to triumph is an understanding of success as tied to moral personhood. And this is why Mateo states, right, that his collegiate achievements will make him a better person. So successful American people are those who demonstrate moral virtues such as hard work and responsibility. And so that success becomes a sign of your moral virtue to others. You have the right stuff to belong. And the converse is true, right? Those who fail did not. So a lot of this kind of proving ground of success happens in schools. And it's not just because the succeeders are there that matters, but because of some of the ideas we have about schooling. Educational and educational striving have been positioned popularly and politically as social goods that enable class and social mobility for minorities and migrants, even if in practice this is not the case. Second, right, as I mentioned, schools are the place where immigrants and native-born populations first encounter each other in a sustained way. And most centrally, educational institutions are places where national identity is formed. And as my students who are here from my first year seminar know, I talk about this a lot, right? It comes through things like saying the Pledge of Allegiance, civics curriculum, but also implicit ways like racialized ability tracking. So Jim, one of the students that I worked with, described an interaction to me where a teacher told him he didn't belong in the higher level math class. There must have been a mistake. It didn't escape Jim that he would be the only Latino, the only migrant, and the only undocumented person in the class. Right? So here he learns that he's not assumed to be the kind of student that belongs. But in Jim's case, right, there's also another level here to how schools work as levers of inclusion or not. As an undocumented migrant, through the 1982 Supreme Court decision Plyler v. Doe, Jim has the right to attend K-12 education, right? So K-12 education, this important social institution, provides undocumented youth like him with this opportunity to build shared citizen identities and feel this sense of belonging as they are included in this state institution. So this all seems pretty grim when we think about education, but I'd also like to point to this idea of education as a site of family obligation. In immigrant families, education takes on a heightened significance because of the unique familial demands of migration. It's about uprooting, it's about leaving family members behind, about finding new roles and responsibilities to each other. Robert Smith, who's a sociologist, describes this particular set of obligations as the immigrant bargain, where he says, quote, sacrifice by parents in immigrating and settling in the United States will be redeemed and validated through the children's achievements in school. So the bargain works in alignment with the American dream because you're still getting that towards that success, but it's also about re-knitting together the social ties of the family and being able to show that those connections still matter. And as young people kind of strove thinking about their families, they uncovered another route to belong besides success. And that's kind of care and family. So maybe you've bought what I'm selling so far, right? And now you're like, oh, I don't know, Andrea, this seems a little extreme. But I want us to think about how we talk about the nation at one level, right? Motherland, fatherland, Uncle Sam, homeland, national family, national heritage. The reason that these terms are used, right, is because they draw on the powerful attachments we feel or may feel like we should feel in family life. And they suggest that our tie to the nation is as strong as that which we feel to our families. Quite simply also, right, the propagation of new citizens, right, happens through family formation and the birth of new children. It's also in the intergenerational transmission of shared values, like the American dream, the idea of public schools as the great equalizer, or even the Latino threat. This is also encoded in law. When we think about citizenship coming through birth to an American citizen, that's one way it is passed on. A central place where we see family in defining the nation is in immigration law. Family reunification since the 1950s has been the bedrock of how immigration policy is defined. But we see that this is a certain idea of who the national family is and can be. So it means conforming to the structure of a white nuclear family, right? A citizen can sponsor the migration of a spouse, their child, a sibling, or a parent, but not an aunt, cousin, or nephew, or precisely kind of the extended family formations common in Latin America and the global South. Moreover, we see things like the specter of immigrant families separated at the border, the denial of citizenship to the internationally adopted children of queer parents, and the deportation of undocumented family members, suggesting that only certain members of the nation have a right to the family at all. And this has been taken up by the immigrant rights movement. We see slogans like "Don't deport my daddy," right? American family immigration has always been about defining what sociologist Kathleen Lee states constitutes a legitimate family and whether such family should be allowed to join the nation. So, as you might imagine, the succeeders were critical of US immigration policy and its effect on their families, especially when that led to the deportation of those they love. But they also looked to shift the scope of what constitutes the US family by demanding the inclusion of their own. They hope to unmoor the limited notions of family by asserting a broader set of kinship ties that they made through care for others, including the care that they believed was embedded in their striving in school. And so they often did that through asserting that their individual success was only possible through the care provided to them through their morally and racially stigmatized family members and friends. So, as John mentioned, right, care is this form of political action when the removal of it, like these deportations, the shuttering of social services, dominate our political landscapes. So when uncaring is the dominant political practice, caring for others takes on additional significance. It's what geographer Kai Askins refers to as the quietly political. All right. I'm sure we're all psyched about all that theory, but let's get back to the people, which seems like it was ages ago. So to kind of go back to, right, we see how Lalo and Matteo are kind of talking about this kind of reveal, right, this sense that that they are nobodies and they must show that they are somebody. And that reveals the sense of needing to, as Latinx people, show that they conform with the American idea of success and membership. And I'd like to fill that out with another example, a game of Duck, Duck, Goose. So for those of you who haven't played Duck, Duck, Goose in a while, you usually in a circle, right? Someone says out something and you run around and you try to get the seat and the next person becomes the caller. So we were waiting for a very late bus, and the Succeeders coordinator suggested we play Duck, Duck, Goose. And students started saying characteristics like you're wearing sneakers or a black hoodie, or you have more than 3 siblings, or you liked then popular boy band One Direction. So as the game progressed, a slight young man shifted the tenor of characteristics called out. He shouted that students should get up if you're illegal. About a third of the assembled students, including the young man who had shouted out the prompt, scattered quietly around the circle. Students did not laugh, as they had with the mention of One Direction, but they murmured to each other. The call's silencing effect revealed not a proud reclamation of the term illegal, but its stigma. Liz shot me a worried glance and interrupted the next caller with a new prompt. "Who's going to college?" she asked excitedly, which I did not just say very excitedly. All the students then got up and ran around an invisible circle of non-college going Latino youth. So in Illegal Duck, Duck, Goose, students used that charged language about immigration status as equally definitional to their sense of self as music, dress, or family. And there are layers to the term illegal as it's been used, not just about undocumented immigration status, but what that status stands for, perceived criminality, immorality, and even who a Latino is or can be. It suggests a deep internalization of stereotypes about Latinx people, definitional to one's own self, and the perception of other Latino people. So it probably also didn't go unnoticed by those young people that Liz diffused the situation by bringing up college. She identified all of the assembled students, including those who are undocumented, as model Latino others who aspire to higher education. And the message there was clear. Illegality and the other Latino stereotypes that go with it can be mitigated through striving. And this became central to how students would navigate the educational process. Hold on, we seem to be having a little... My students are also not surprised since I always have tech problems. Ugh. There we go. It also became clear how they did this in the college admissions process. So education scholar Terry also argues that the desire to prove stereotypers and stereotypes wrong is a powerful motivator for individual youth achievement, but one that relies on this individual solution to structural racism. And again, it also relies on this internalized deficit perspective of oneself and community. And as they draw on those stereotypes to disprove them, they end up reproducing them for others. And that's what happened with Lupita in her college essays. And I should say, going back a minute, students chose all their own pseudonyms, and Lupita chose hers because she thought it was the most stereotypical Mexican name. And another student chose hers, Courtney, because she said it sounded like a white girl name, and she wanted to confuse all of you. But I think that shows, right, students are really aware of how they're being racialized, including through their names. So Lupita was inspired to apply to a primarily white-serving institution I call South after cleaning an elderly woman's house. She felt that the woman looked down on her because she was Latina. But upon learning that the woman's son went to South, she decided it was her school, stating, "I felt like in a way, if I go to that school, I'm just as good as her son. And it's not because of race that makes us the same, it's because I was able to get into school. We went through the same admissions process, we both got in. So it doesn't make him better than me just because he's white and I'm Hispanic. And the way that I feel like I'm like competing against him, and it's almost my way to prove I'm just as good as you are." So here, right, she links this institutional belonging to kind of a sense of being included in national institutions just the same as a white American might be. By attending and applying to the same school, going through the same admissions process, she experiences a kind of social equality with him. So given her view that admissions was kind of this equalizer, it's interesting that she chose to write about what she and other students called being Mexican in her college admissions essay. Because in some ways, right, that acknowledges that she is different from her employer's son. And she partially recognized the contradiction of her approach in this essay. She stated, it was contradicting to me because I wanted people to know I was different, but I didn't want people to use my race as a reason to be like, oh, she's Hispanic. They don't succeed very often, kind of thing. So here, I'm saying that she partially recognized the contradiction here because she sees the discussion of difference as a potential strike against her, that an admissions officer might see her through stereotypes and the subpar status of Latino learners. She reproduces that narrative in her thinking about herself, that she has to proactively diffuse that stereotype. She went on to tell me that she wanted admissions officers to know that she's different, but that I understood what it was like to be an American, that I'm not like the typical Hispanic, I don't know how to say, very Hispanic-y. So I asked her to elaborate on what being very Hispanic-y or typical Hispanic was, and she said it meant dropping out, getting pregnant, and being undocumented. She, in contrast, is a native-born citizen who will not get pregnant, will complete college and pursue white-collar work, which she described in her writing. So the central motivation in her essay, right, is to thwart potential stereotyping of her, to mark herself as distinctive, not the typical Hispanic. And in so doing, she reproduces those, in showing that she's just as good as you are, she reproduces exclusionary narratives in service of herself. By drawing on the stereotypes to make herself distinctive, she reproduces those stereotypes for others. But again, it's getting pretty grim in this talk. So youth also were seeking to transform belonging. And I describe this in the book through 3 chapters, one on parents, one on siblings, and one on friends. And today I'm just going to talk about parents and friends. And the way that they attempted to upend these limited terms of belonging was to demonstrate that individual success was dependent on others, in particular others, and make claims for their inclusion. But we see that this works on a more and less transformative scale. And the first one is largely more conservative in its approach. So like Mateo, Marina presented to a group of succeeders. She was a college student at the time, and she framed her educational success this way. My mom had dreams for me. That's why I'm here. I'm not mad she brought me here. I have this dream to go to college because she did that. She narrates her collegiate aspirations vis-a-vis her mother's decision to migrate without documents from Tennessee to Mexico. And Marina's mom's decision to migrate with her as a toddler made many difficulties for Marina in a pre-DACA world. She couldn't get a driver's license, qualify for in-state tuition, or apply for jobs in the regulated economic sector. But here, right, Marina positions her good aspiration to college as fundamentally tied to the bad migration of her parents, of her mother. And in doing so, it becomes a way to reclaim the moral rightness of parental migration by relying on what we might think a good parent would do for their child's future. By becoming an educated person, a person valued in a credential society, students might make their parents' migration good, because without it, they might not have strove towards this good of education at all. And so the image here is from the kind of, what we might call it, like second generation dreamer activism that does precisely what Marina's doing in her narration of her education's origins. Her mother is the original dreamer, the one who gave her the dream. So in the final example, I'm going to move towards that more radical political claim that young people are making. In most of my interviews and in many chats, students talked about the club as like a family or family. One student even said Succeeders means family. And this familial language was also exchanged endlessly among students and anyone who participated in Succeeders by the phrase somos una familia, we are a family. And when I asked students what that meant, they said that they felt cared for, understood, and accepted to a way similar to how they felt or wished they felt at home. So we can think of this as just a nicety to describe kind of a good time, right? Or perhaps evidence of the kind of supposed familism of Latin American people and Latinos. But family bonds, as I've argued, are loaded terms. It's, in fact, for Latinos, it's been a rallying point for organizing, making rights claims, and demanding inclusion in the United States. And right, it's also this symbolic and material grounds where nation states have legally enshrined the exclusion of immigrant and minority populations. It also has these other moral meanings tied to how we see ourselves as good people. By extending the term family to their fellow succeeders in name and practice, succeeders do critical social work. They state what belonging could be through a powerful vernacular term. They demand a reconsideration of their moral worth and worthiness through their creative stretching of the term's means. So what did it mean to be like a family? It was small ways like outreach to the Succeeders Club when you were in college, listening to each other's worries, achievements and failures, status disclosures, and sharing in the hopes and fears of being first-gen students and Americans, or as one student put it, being the only Browns in certain academic spaces. And this builds to a sense of linked fate, something that political scientists bandy about, right? An awareness of what happens to the group that one is part of has effects on individual members. Linked fate explains the shifts that succeeders make from reproducing the exclusionary terms of membership to transforming this. And this shift often occurred when succeeders recognized that the line between a succeeder and a failure was razor thin. So for one example of that, Jenny was one of the 4 club officers there, and she talked about the fact that she saw that her undocumented friends were having a difficult time applying to college. And she said, I don't want to let that chance go to waste. It hurts me seeing my my friends that are undocumented, like, I don't know, it's hard seeing them. And then after talking about the difficulty of seeing her friends, she said, sometimes even though I am a citizen, I still feel like, not like an immigrant, but it just makes me want to help people more, like go out there and serve the Hispanic community. So she starts to see that even though her friends are just like her in terms of high achievement, they're not going to have the same opportunities. It unmoors her sense of achievement as the proper set of criteria for belonging, and in some ways, right, it disrupts her sense of belonging, but she doesn't quite extend it about how she feels about citizenship, but not necessarily towards what citizenship itself is. As my students will know, that only can come through candy. As John mentioned about Edwin and Jim, I'll just kind of briefly go to this because I've been gabbing too long. But this was a Valentine's Day club. No one was there because it was Valentine's Day. And so the students were kind of assembling these candygrams, and they were chatting with each other about DACA applications, about what to do about certain friends, and how to kind of navigate the everyday challenges of being a teenager. And so what I noticed was that one student who was often very chatty, Edwin, was just kind of talking off in the corner to Jim. These students were very different from each other. Edwin was getting in trouble in school. He was not a high achiever like Jim. And what I found out was that Jim was helping Edwin write a love note. So when I went home that night, I'm writing up my field notes, and I was like, this is just teenage gossip, and not at all what I hope to find as a budding anthropologist. But when I reconsidered it, it was more than that. It was a type of sociality that can repair the worlds, that make young men like Jim, who share undocumented status, but one's an achiever and one's not. It can show that those young men are recognizing that they have linked fate, that caring about each other when teachers are retracting care matters. And so I'd just like to end by saying that we see here that in the seceders' experiences that belonging is limited. And it means conforming to a specific performances of deservingness. And for them, it meant being a good student and a college-bound one. It can also mean painfully asserting difference from one's community. When Lupita talks about not wanting to be that kind of Latina, she also is marking distance between her mother, who was that kind of Latina. Lupita's mother got pregnant very young, and she's illiterate in Spanish and English. When you are making your success linked to the degradation of others who are close to you, and can cause a lot of harm. But these young people are also speaking back to that deficit construction of themselves and those they love. And that also happened to Lupita, who described going to college as a self-hating brown girl, but coming out as someone who saw a linked fate, not only with the Latinos that she got to know there, but with other students, and got involved in her classes and in her extracurriculars, and understanding that we all share vulnerabilities. At its widest, I think these findings point to the everyday ways we can change our world. Care is a way to repair the social orders that injure us, as we see when Jim refuses to leave behind at-risk Edwin, or when Jenny realizes that her friends deserve to go to college just as much as she does. In the wake of even harsher political and cultural context, the succeeders continue on. They have graduation parties and weddings. They celebrate being Employee of the Month. They send their own children to better schools with hopes and dreams they dared not wish for themselves. They protest, they don't protest. Whether or not they are going to school or struggling to get by, each succeeder is building their own kind of success through the unfolding projects of their young lives and those lives' connections to others. They show that they are somebody. Thank you.
You something to say?
No, we'll be moving into the Q&A part of the event, so we're going to have this mic stand in the center here. If you don't mind kind of lining up and asking your questions from there, that would be great.
Feels like the Oprah portion of the event. Please, not all at once.
Hi, I'm Joe, and one part of the lecture, and I guess the idea of the book that I think about a lot is the part having to do with, balancing the pressure of feeling the need to be better than other Hispanics, or I guess in my case just other Latinos, and indirectly putting down their fellow classmates in the process. So I guess my question is, Professor Flores, what do you think about what's a healthy way that we can prove that we can make it and that we can overcome the stereotypes without, and I guess necessarily, feeding into the stereotypes and throwing our fellow Hispanics or Latinos under the bus?
Yeah, so I think part of that, part of how we might think about a healthy way of doing that is students, right, are very aware of the racialization that's happening to them, right, just in the way that they chose their pseudonyms. There's no reason that students that can't be part of education to kind of be aware that opportunities are not equally distributed. So that, and this is what Lupita experienced when she went to college. She wrote about her mom being illiterate in a class about development in the third world, right? And so from there, she's able to see her mother in a different way, I think. And I think that really speaks to the transformative power. And I don't see that that should just be limited to college. It can be in the K through 12 context as well. And I think that way it allows students to see their achievements as linked to the missing opportunities that may have been there for those who came before them.
Hello, I'm Leo.
I recognize you both from class.
Something that you discussed a lot was students measuring their success not by sort of quantitative metrics like graduation rates, but more of their own personal goals. But at the same time with the Succeeders program, it seemed like it was very college oriented.
Yeah.
Could you talk a bit about what sort of the other maybe I don't want to say not as big,
Sure.
but goals that took place before college or before graduation that seem to impact students and their sense of belonging throughout their high school experience in the program?
Yeah, so I think part of it that I kind of rushed through realizing that I had been just talking forever, was that Jim mentions, right, as he is college bound, graduation's just around the corner, he's talking about his idea of success, and he said it's not just the academics, but having people come behind you as well. So feeling that sense of linked fate and who will come behind you. And he talks about making a difference in the life of a person. So when I think it's important that he uses the term life there, because he's pointing to and acts like caring about Edwin's love note, right, to show that concerted interest in another person's well-being, not just whether or not they go to college, but also that they feel a sense of connection to others, right? And so a lot of the stuff about the immigrant bargain, about how they care for their siblings' educations, is not necessarily about who gets access or who does better on a test, but knowing that you fulfilled those obligations to each other to care for each other and support each other's well-being beyond school. And that was important because part of the reason that Edwin is struggling is that care is being retracted for him because he's seen as someone who doesn't care about school, right? Or someone who's not succeeding in traditional ways. So I think that was the kind of the crux of what that feeling of belonging came for, is that students are aware, right, when they are seen as not the right kind of student or one that teachers don't pay attention to. But in the Succeeders organization, it was open door. It wasn't just high achieving students. It was a mix of high and low achievers. And that's what made that Valentine's Day special, is that you saw these young people actually were interacting across ability tracking and in a way recognizing the kind of shared humanity and shared caring that could make them feel like somebody. I think that's really what could be those other steps to success for them.
Thank you.
Hi, Andrea. I'm Trisha. I know that you mentioned you had stayed in touch with the students, and I wonder programmatically if the Succeeders also does that, if they follow the students through college, and then also if you've connected this research to local organizations like College Visions and other organizations that are doing the same work and thinking about local students in the process.
I haven't connected with anyone locally in Providence. I continue to be connected to the Succeeders program and a kind of program that grew out of it for college retention for students. And actually what's kind of special about the Succeeders program is a lot of these young people just continue to stay involved as college students. As you saw, right, like Mateo and Marina both had been in Succeeders and come back and give back to the program. And in fact, some of the staff in recent years have been drawn from the alumni ranks. They do keep in touch with the students in terms of formal tracking about how they're doing. You know, it was a two-person operation, so it's amazing what people could keep in their heads about how students were doing. But with the growth of this college persistence program, we see that those students kind of keeping in touch between the two programs.
Hi, Professor Flores. I'm Michelle. I was curious as to what you saw in your time with the program in terms of the use of Spanish and English within the students themselves, as well as the language barriers that the students may have faced having parents that only spoke Spanish or having Spanish been their first language, and not being able to maybe access certain services because their parents couldn't access them. So if you could speak a little bit on the use of language.
Sure. So there's a couple of different things that are interesting there. Students often, when I ask them about their educational histories, were quick to say, like, I got out of ELL really quickly. It was like a big thing, right? Many of them were working as language brokers for their families. Lupita did all the bills. Her father moved back north in the Northeast to do work at a higher rate to kind of make the families living more comfortable in Tennessee. And her father did that, I think, when she was around age 9. And since then, she paid all the bills and handled all the materials that came to the house. And so students talked about their parents, having trouble accessing things. But in the chapter about siblings, I talk about how students are often the ones who end up doing that for their siblings. And that becomes the point where they start to really form that critique of what success is, as they start to understand their siblings might be more advantaged than them because of the work that they're doing for them. And so the other kind of interesting, this isn't in the book, so bonus, but there was one club meeting where some newcomer students had come in just from Mexico, and most of the teachers who sponsored the program were bilingual or were Spanish teachers or heritage language teachers or ELL teachers, and they told the students, make sure you just speak in Spanish so that they can understand, because pretty much everyone who was in the Succeeders program was balanced bilingual, and the students were good at starting to speak in Spanish, and then about 10 minutes into the club just stopped speaking Spanish, and only myself and the teacher were now speaking Spanish. Those students never came back to the club. So there definitely was a way that for newcomers it was much more difficult to participate in this, even though the students were all bilingual. I think that has to do with the emphasis on developing English only in schools. Interestingly, though, the year after my field work was completed, there had been one student who was not a balanced bilingual, and she became the president of the club at her school. So it was really school dependent, but I think that when students were telling me their histories and said, I got out of ELL really early, I think that was another way of distancing themselves from stereotypes. And certainly students talked about, like, they expect that we all have accents, and I don't have an accent. So it wasn't just the use of the language, but signals that you were bilingual that they were particularly aware of as a negative.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Professor Flores.
Hi.
My name is Neonta, and I was wondering, as someone who doesn't identify as Latinx, the cross-cultural aspects of this, and if you think that would be implemented effectively in the program, or if there was a benefit to kind of keeping it specific to Latinx. And in addition to that, the most surprising thing you noticed during your research in your time there, especially in terms of like student perception on self-identity and belonging.
So that's again, this isn't in the book, but these students are right in the south part of the city. They're going to school with other migrant origin youth. And as I was kind of ending my research, but then in years subsequent, some of these schools have ended up with a lot of Egyptian students who started attending Succeeders Club meetings. And then there was a question of, should we just call this, like, is this just for everyone now? And in some clubs there was resistance in some schools there was resistance to that. Partially, these students did share common narratives, but the Egyptian students were universally documented, right? And I think there still was a need for a space that was recognizing this legal vulnerability that a lot of Latinx students were facing. So they certainly shared a lot of common bonds about the immigrant bargain and feelings of obligation to the broader immigrant community. But I think there definitely is, while that cross-cultural exchange was valuable, I think status disclosure was something that came, that can feel particularly vulnerable outside of kind of the family, right? The most surprising thing I found, that is a good question. Sorry, this is taking me a while. I think the most surprising thing I found that was made me very angry at the time was there was a big push to get graduation rates up, and I actually kind of, and it shouldn't be surprising to me because I study this, right? But the way that students were being pushed out of schools. And I was also teaching ESL to adults at the time, and parents would come up to me with letters from the school saying, does this mean my child can't go to school anymore? And in some ways, the document itself was very misleading, and like I had to read it a few times to be like, what are they even saying here? But they were trying to push out students who were over 19 and folks who might not graduate within 5 years to kind of, in some ways, artificially boost graduation rates. And it was just, maybe it wasn't the most surprising, but it was the most troubling thing I found. And realizing that just how fragile that institutional connection can be, and how for many of the young people who were able to subvert those orders trying to push them out, how it really came down to having a supportive adult in their corner who was able to navigate that system. And it happens every day.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor Flores. I'm Coco. Like when you said like caring and uncaring are political, what do you mean by this?
So what I mean, right, is that we see I think in the like kind of veneer of policy, right, we think of it as this thing that's just about law and kind of making the terms of how we all decide to live together in an orderly society. But underneath all of those policies is a decision whether or not to care for the needs of others. So we see this when school funding is cut, for example, to a high needs school. It says, I'm not going to put my money where my mouth is, right? I'm going to not care about these learners. And I think we also see that, right, when we make the decision to deport someone's father, and realizing that that is not something that's just about you entered with documents or not, but really is about the relationships that that person may have with someone else. Is that?
Yeah, thank you.
Hi. Hi.
I don't know if this is relevant or not, but I know in the news, again, if you believe stuff you read on the internet, they talk about gifted programs
Yeah.
and how it's geared more towards the white students in
Yeah.
these programs, and it's basically pushing out students of color, students of other backgrounds.
Yeah.
How does that affect these students that are being sort of pushed out by education?
Yeah. So some of these students would have been labeled gifted had there been a program in that school, but they were more likely to be put in a program that was about kind of college access instead. I certainly, like, for example, with that student Jim who's being told he shouldn't be in AP, I think we see that beyond whether or not you get put in gifted and talented or not, that the ways that you're kind of just tracked in the everyday curriculum also push students out. Another example that some of my students have heard from some lecture or another I gave is they had these vocational academies in the school to kind of get career readiness as part of the programming. And, you know, they were health, hospitality, and they kind of a little bit of variance per school. And there was this one school that had an education one and a automotive track. And this one young woman who was an aspiring teacher got put in the automotive track. And she wanted to get it changed, and they were like, we just can't do that. And I remember we were sorting kind of the paperwork of students, and what we saw, right, is that Latino men were being put in the construction track or the automotive track, as this young girl was, right? And so beyond just gifted and talented, it can just happen in everyday ways. And like this was something that every student had to be part of one academy or another. And I can gladly tell you that that student is now a teacher.
Good for them.
Yeah. I hope that answered your question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. And she won a scholarship from the Metro Nashville's teachers. So.
I think we have time for one last question.
Hi. Thank you so much for your presentation. I really appreciated it. I think one question I have is about your research method.
Yep.
It seems like the research you do requires a lot of trust,
Yep.
both on the part of the researcher and also the students involved.
Yep.
So, like, what was the process in, like, earning this trust and
Yep.
also, like, fostering and maintaining it?
That's a great question. So when I was trying to decide if I was going to become an anthropologist or not, to me it was this decision about trust, because a lot of academic research can feel very extractive, and I think particularly in some ways anthropology, because you're just like always there, right, with your little notebook. And for me, when I decided to do this, I knew that meant and because I was going to be working with young people, it meant that I had to make a commitment to be part of their lives as much or as little as they wanted for, frankly, the rest of time. And so I was careful about that. And for the first 3 months of my research, I didn't try to interview anyone or survey or anything like that. I just was around. Part of building that trust is not just telling people what's on the consent form or explaining what your research is, but also telling people who you are. And so I shared with them about my own background. I was inspired to do this research thinking about my mother's family. My mom is a white working class woman from Boston, first in her family to go to college. The book's dedicated to my grandmother, who was the daughter of immigrants from Canada and Ireland who dropped out of school when she was 15. I told students that. And I also told them that I didn't know what it was like to be them, because that was not my experience. And so I also think that as a researcher, that also involves telling them what I'm going to tell you about them. And so I have had the great but uncomfortable experience of sitting in a Waffle House and watching someone read an article draft and be like, what do you think about this? And them telling me what they thought about it. And I think that that's imperative to do this kind of work. And there are some things that I don't write about that I know about these young people, because it would be a betrayal of our interpersonal trust for me to tell that story.
Excellent. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you, Andrea. It's been wonderful to hear about this and talk about it.